Hello, everyone. I'm so pleased to be able to welcome Theodore Dalrymple here today. For those who don't know, Theodore Dalrymple is a prolific writer. His work appears in all the major publications, and he's written numerous books on a range of subjects, drawing on his vast wealth of knowledge and experiences from working as a psychiatrist and prison doctor. Theodore, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for asking me.
So how are things in Paris? You're living in Paris at the moment.
Yes, well, I've been here since the beginning of the lockdown, or actually slightly before that, and it seems that they're relaxing in the sense that people are not taking the restrictions quite so seriously as they were, and also the police don't seem to be checking people as assiduously as they were. They were a bit like ants. They suddenly came out. There's suddenly lots of police on the streets when the restrictions were started, and then they seem to pull back. They're a bit like ants in my kitchen. When there's jam on the surface, they suddenly come out, and then when there's no more jam, they go away again. You don't know where they've gone or where they came from.
So, do you still need a paper permit to leave your house, or is?
Yes. You fill in a laissez-passer and you tick the box and you say when you're going out so that they can check that you haven't been out for more than an hour. You're supposed to be out for an hour, not more than an hour, and not further than a kilometre away from your domicile. So it's quite restrictive, and all the green spaces have been closed off. So there's nowhere green to go. If you don't have a garden, there's nowhere green to go.
Are you feeling quite claustrophobic? And you feel quite trapped?
Not really, because of late in my life, I haven't done very much other than stay at home and read and write anyway. So, I mean, of course, it is more claustrophobic than it was, and one doesn't like to be told even not to do those things that one wouldn't have done anyway. But as restricted people go, I'm very fortunate. It hasn't affected me as much as it would have affected, shall we say, athletes.
Mm. So you talked about writing and reading. Am I right to think you started sending articles to the Spectator in the 1980s? Is that when you began writing?
Yes, 1983 it was, actually, to be precise. And in those days, Charles Moore was then the deputy editor, not the editor. Part of his job was to look at unsolicited articles. And I just sent in articles, and he published them. I only subsequently realized, or learned, because he told me, that actually it was very unusual for unsolicited articles to be published. And in fact, I doubt now very much whether publications actually look at unsolicited articles. But anyway, you can print them all, or you can publish them all on the internet, so it doesn't really matter.
And at this time, were you working as a psychiatrist or a prison?
I was working as a psychiatrist and a physician in the Gilbert Islands. And the first article that I ever wrote was about a book which was very famous in its time called The Pattern of Islands. I don't know whether you've heard of it, but it was very famous at the time, and it sold 1 million copies. It was by Sir Arthur Grimble, who was the governor of the Gilbert Islands in the days when they were a British colony or British possession. And in the book, he portrays his life as being almost idyllic, and the islands as being idyllic. But I discovered that in his private correspondence and his correspondence with the Colonial Office, he detested the islands and was always complaining about them, and he wanted to go to a more important place. And anyway, he had chronic amoebic dysentery, which I think probably would be enough to sour anybody's attitude to where he was living. And that was the first article I ever wrote. as far as I remember.
And so you travelled all around Africa, didn't you?
Yes.
And were you working as a psychiatrist at that time?
No. I mean, well, I worked in when I worked as a doctor. I worked as a general doctor, but I also travelled a lot in Africa. For example, I once crossed Africa by public transport and wrote a book about that. And it took quite a long time, and went from Zanzibar as far as Timbuktu, and of course it took quite a long time. And I saw Africa, as it were, from the bottom up, and I loved it. But I hadn't really been back to Africa since about 1993, I think.
And when you came back to Britain, is that when you started to think about the problems in British society and certain...
Yes, because as Dr. Johnson says, all judgment is comparative, and so I had quite a lot to compare Britain with, and I found quite a lot that was to me very alarming and rather surprising.
You've written about a permanent underclass in Britain. Could you try and just explain what you mean by the underclass and why you think it's appeared?
Oddly enough, I don't really like the term underclass very much, because it implies that there's a kind of a lumpen proletariat, if you like, a Marxist lumpen proletariat, which is maybe 5% of the population, whatever percentage of population it is, and that it has almost no connection with the rest of society. But this is not my view. I mean, there are, of course, people who are entirely dependent on the state and so on and so forth. But what I was worried about more was that Britain seemed to be becoming, if you like, an underclass culture society. That people who were not actually of the underclass were nevertheless behaving as if they were. And that was far more worrying to me, because if there's 5% of the population that is an underclass, this is tragic for them, and unpleasant perhaps, but it isn't disastrous for the whole society. You can cope with that. But if, on the contrary, we have a society with its constant downward cultural aspiration, which seemed to me to be the Britain that I now saw, then that was far more serious.
And
so to give you an example, we now have a very large population of people who are unable to address others in a reasonably civilized and polite fashion. Not because they're bad people, but because no one's ever told them how to behave, so that people in shops, now I'm 70, people just call young people, 18, 19, call me mate. And this is a very small, of course, this is a very small thing, but it's a sign of a cultural degeneration, which hasn't actually gone so far in France, for example.
That's interesting.
Or any other country that known to me.
So that's interesting you say it's not gone as far in France. Why do you think in Britain in particular this decline in morals and manners and values has happened?
I'm not sure I have a full explanation. I think it clearly as the Russians say about fish, I'm not sure whether it's true of fish, but it's probably true of societies. They rot from the head down. So that if one takes the extreme vulgarity of the BBC, for example, or other broadcasting media, and in fact the general vulgarity of British life, it came from the top down. There were no marches through the street of people demanding more vulgarity. That never happened, and in fact, it was a kind of imposed vulgarity, which was now, in my view, so deeply entered our culture that it's almost ineradicable. So when you come to Britain, you see a vulgarity which you don't in manners and in almost everything that you don't see in other countries. And it's not a question of money, not a question of money or poverty either. When I come to, when I cross the channel on the, in the tunnel with a car, I see people who are obviously very well off, or at least able to borrow very large sums of money to buy expensive cars, which of course is not quite the same as being very well off, as we have discovered recently. But anyway, they behave in a very vulgar way in which you wouldn't see French people at the same social level behaving.
Do you think the way in which this kind of liberal intellectual elite who has passed down this vulgarity you speak of, do you think that was conscious? Were there thinkers who decided they wanted society to go this way, or do you think it's just a natural progress?
No, I think initially they were just making fun of things. They didn't realize that things are actually quite fragile, and that what seemed solid wasn't really solid at all, because things aren't very solid. Society isn't very solid. It can fall apart very quickly, actually. And that's one of the reasons why prudence is so important a virtue. To give you an example, I spoke to Jonathan Miller once. I got on very well with him, and he was a very talented, intelligent man, and a very, very good theatre producer, amongst other things. He was very talented. Anyway, I was talking about him, and of course he didn't recognize that his kind of satire back in the 1960s actually played a part in the degeneration which he now loathed. He saw this vulgarity, but he didn't recognize that possibly he might have played a part in its development. And of course he didn't intend to, because he wasn't a vulgar man. On the contrary, he was a very cultivated man.
That's interesting. I think Clive James also in the sort of early 2000s was also concerned about the same kind of things, and does seem as though lots of the intellectual figures from the 60s who then got into later age started to detect just in the general culture a decline, and I don't think perhaps they maybe considered their own role in how that happened.
I don't know. Did Clive James think of his role?
Well,
I don't know.
I just remember seeing an interview of him where he was talking about, just going to the shops and just seeing just a general decline in manners, which he regretted. Yes. But I think he was.
Well, you see, I mean, an instructive history, if you like, is that of Lady Chatterley's Lover, which rather absurdly was banned here, and I can't remember. It was of course, in Philip Larkin's famous poem. But intellectuals actually lied in the trial, in my view, lied in the trial about how wonderful that book is. It is not a wonderful book. It's not that I would ban it or anything like that, but it's not a wonderful book, and actually in many respects is a rather nasty book. And much of the writing is extremely bad. But because they wanted it to be unbanned, they wanted it to be made available everywhere, they were prepared to say things in court which were, to my mind, evidently not true. So in other words, the end justified their means, which was to, I can't say perjure themselves in court, because I can't prove that they were saying things which they didn't believe to be true, but which I don't believe they believed to be true, because the book is so self-evidently a bad book. And this was the, and we've seen lots of intellectuals taking part in this kind of what can one call it, undermining of refinement. So, for example, John Carey, who's a very good writer and a very good literary critic and so on, wrote a book called What Good Are the Arts? And although I don't believe for a moment he would like his own children to be interested only in rap music and to look only at violent videos, he nevertheless in that book tries to make out that there's no difference between the good and the bad in art and culture. And I don't know him, but I can't believe that he actually in his heart believes that and would be happy if his children behaved as if it were true. And yet here we have a book saying precisely that.
I wonder if it's because most of the academics and liberal intelligentsia don't really see the effects of a decline in society in the rest of the country. Whereas you yourself, you've worked in prisons, you've dealt with people that suffer from mental health problems, and all of these kind of experiences. Do you think that's probably sharpened or focused in your mind some of these concerns?
I am sure that's true, yes, because unless I had done the work I did do, I would have very little idea about this. I mean, it would be... I remember once at the New Statesman, I used to write for the New Statesman occasionally, and I went to lunch there. And I won't mention the name because I don't want to be nasty about an individual, but when I described what I saw, he was a very clubbable individual, and I liked him, but he leant across the table and said, "You know strange people." And I said, "Well, there are a lot of them, you know." And actually, if you look out of the window, you can see some of them if you care to look, and or I should say observe. You see Watson, but you do not observe, as Sherlock said. But anyway, it's true that people can and do hide themselves away from it. This is not a new phenomenon because that's exactly what Thackeray said to Mayhew when Mayhew published his book about the London poor. He said, Thackeray said, this was all within sight of our front door, but we didn't see it, we didn't notice. But of course, working where I did work and doing the work that I did, even the blindest person could hardly have failed to notice what I noticed. Of course, people might disagree with my analysis of how the phenomena came about. That's perfectly reasonable. But the first thing was to try and get people to admit the phenomena. And even now, you don't get everyone admitting the phenomena, even though to me it all seems perfectly obvious. But as Orwell said, you know, sometimes the duty of the intellectual, the first task of the intellectual is to see the obvious. Apart from anything else, one of the dangers of intellectual life is to look at everything through a distorting lens of some kind of theory.
When you spoke to criminals, different people in prisons, were they conscious of why they committed crime? Did they want to take any responsibility, or had they completely absorbed the mantra of the left as to why crime happens?
it was complicated because they had both absorbed that mantra, but also knew that it was bogus. So that they had a kind of peculiar state of cognitive dissonance, which it was possible to get them to understand. I never said anything except to one or two people who were beyond reaching. I never said anything in my writings that I was not prepared to say to the prisoners, and they all understood it, actually. And I won't say they all liked me, that would be going too far, but at least they knew that I wasn't trying to flannel them or wasn't accepting untruths hook, line and sinker. To give you an example, heroin addicts, and there was a sudden enormous increase in people who injected heroin and claimed, wrongly actually, to be criminal because they needed the money for drugs. This is false, but anyway, I can go into that. I would always ask them why they started taking heroin, and almost universally they answered, I fell in with the wrong crowd. That was their explanation. And I would say, well, it's very strange. I meet many people who fell in with the wrong crowd, but I never meet any member of the wrong crowd itself. And although they were supposed to be very uneducated and on average less intelligent than the man in the street, which I never really found, but despite that, they immediately grasped the point and started to laugh, because their explanation was, of course, entirely bogus. But on the other hand, when it served them, when it had some kind of worth as an explanation, as it often did, they would use it and appear to believe it. And of course, if you tell yourself you believe something long enough, you do begin to believe it. So it's not a straightforward matter of either lying to achieve an end, or actually believing something wholly to be true. There's a very peculiar hinterland between these two things. And you see it in, for example, in cases of people who are suing for injuries that they may have received an injury and they may have actually had harm done to them. But by the time the law has finished with them, they have magnified the harm done to them enormously, because it's in their interest to do so. But they're not straightforwardly lying. They've rehearsed these things in their mind all the time, or sometimes for years. And so they come to believe it. So it's, as I said, it's not a straightforward question of either they're lying or they believe wholeheartedly in what they're saying.
With your time spent in prisons, you obviously would have interviewed lots of people and probably would have heard terrible things. And your work has concentrated on decline. Do you ever get depressed dealing with all of these sorts of issues?
Personally, no. I think I managed to remain cheerful. I'm not sure I would have remained cheerful if I hadn't written about it. I felt some kind of catharsis, I suppose, in writing about it, but also I felt that since most people had absolutely no idea of what I was writing about and that it was a very important matter, so I felt that I was both helping myself and to an extent, to a very tiny extent, helping the country, as it were. It preserved me from becoming depressed. But to have seen everything like that and not to be able to communicate it to others, I would have found very depressing. And once I mean, everything that I write, of course, is a reflection. It's not just raw experience. I once tried to keep a diary of my raw experience of what I saw in the hospital, heard in the hospital, what I saw and heard in the prison, and it was just too terrible. I couldn't keep it up for very long, and no one could have written it, because actually things were far worse than I was depicting.
Did you communicate with colleagues about it, and did they share your views?
I didn't communicate it with colleagues, really. They eventually knew my views. When it came, I wrote a book about heroin addiction, and the meaning of heroin addiction. And I was very, very fortunate to work with colleagues who agreed with my point of view, because I was seeing things which seemed to me to be perfectly obvious, but at the same time officially denied. So unless you've got somebody else seeing the things, saying that they're seeing the things that you're seeing, you begin to wonder, well, is it I who am mad? Am I hallucinating, if you like? Am I thinking I'm seeing things when I'm not actually seeing them, when everyone else is denying it, denying what I see? Just to give you one small example. In the prison, when prisoners came in, and this was, I mean, it's 15 years ago since I was working in the prison, so things may have changed since then. But in those days, anyway, there was a law, a regulation, I think it was a law, that every prisoner had to be examined by a doctor within 24 hours of his arrival. I think it was a very good thing, actually. But anyhow, and I would see them all come in, and many of them would be in a large room, gathered in a large room, waiting to be examined or seen by me. And they would all be in a waiting room, and they would be laughing and joking. And many of them would be drug addicts. And when they came in individually into my room, they stopped laughing and joking and were in the last phases of the most terrible agony, in the hope that they would persuade me that they were really suffering and that I would then prescribe something. And there were, I mean, I don't know, maybe my presence makes people suffer in this terrible way, but I don't think that's the explanation. And this was something I noticed that everybody had noticed, but nobody drew any conclusions from it.
And
there's an obvious conclusion to be drawn from it, but nobody did draw a conclusion. So when I saw it and did draw conclusions that at least, I will not say nobody ever drew, but most people didn't draw, I thought, well, is there something wrong with me?
Why do you think people didn't want to actually face the obvious conclusions about addiction and drug taking?
Well, I think I think there are possibly two reasons. The first is, of course, it threatens a whole world outlook if you do start thinking about these things, because you have to start thinking about people whom you prefer to think of as victims in terms other than that of sheer victimhood. They are people making decisions. They make decisions like you and me. So in a sense, to regard them like that is more, if you like, existentially egalitarian than many people are prepared to be. And one of the reasons is the decline of the view. I mean, I'm not a religious believer. I don't believe in religion at all. But the view that man is born with original sin, that everyone is a sinner, that everyone needs some kind of forgiveness, enable people to say, yes, you've done wrong, but I will try to help you. But now, Now, with the more secular view, we have to look on people who do things wrongly as if they are victims in order to be able to help them. And so we twist intellectually the evidence and the reasoning to make people into victims, so that we then feel that we are able to help them, that we have a duty to help them, because of course we will solve their problems. And that communicated itself to the prisoners incidentally. They would often say to me, I would stop if only I got the help. And I would say, well, what is the help that you want? How is it that anybody is going to stop you doing what you're doing? And they, of course, had no idea, which in a way gave them a locus standi to continue doing what they were already doing and possibly wanted to do.
In terms of the criminal justice system, you've criticised that quite a lot in some of your work, and the way in which, for example, police often react to crime when it's too late, or will punish the homeowner defending his house rather than the person that's tried to rob him.
I don't think that happens very often, but there have been cases of it. I don't think it happens very often. That we mustn't exaggerate. Yes.
Perhaps symptomatic of a certain way of viewing crime.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you think there's any hope with the criminal justice system, because, for example, I think Rory Stewart, he was the former Minister for Prisons and Justice, was giving lots of speeches and writing about how he was going to reform prisons, but he was taking, obviously, the liberal reformist view that too many people were in prisons, and that's what needs to change, which I guess you would disagree with. So,
yeah, I do disagree with it. I disagree with it on a number of grounds. People often say that Britain has more prisoners per head than other European countries. It's only marginal, actually. We have marginally more prisoners than Spain, for example. It's not that long ago, but Spain had more prisoners than we. But anyway, that isn't the right way of looking at it. I don't think I've ever seen this point in our newspapers, even in conservative newspapers, namely that the number of prisoners per head is not a proper measure. Because, to give you an example, if no crime had ever been committed in Britain, let's say there was no crime at all, and we had one prisoner, that would be an outrage, because he would be in prison for no good reason. It would be a miscarriage of justice. So the number of prisoners is not per head. And incidentally, if we had just one prisoner, although he would be wrongly imprisoned, we'd have a very low rate of imprisonment. So the rate of imprisonment per head of population is not the relevant measure. The relevant measure, or I won't say there's no single relevant measure, but a relevant measure is the number of prisoners compared with the number of crimes. And if you look, for example, at Eurostat statistics for what they're worth, and everybody has to use these statistics because we don't really have anything else we can look at, you will see that Spain has 6 times as many prisoners per violent crime as Britain. And it will give you, I think you'd have to be an intellectual to find that unsurprising, to find it unsurprising that Spain has fewer violent crimes than Britain. As I said, you'd have to be an intellectual to find that surprising. And one can go on and on about it. I mean, I can give lots and lots of examples. And when you see that a recently released prisoner has just committed some terrible crime, having fairly recently before committed a terrible crime. It's always dealt with in our newspapers as if it's some kind of anomaly, but it isn't an anomaly, it is the system. That is the system. And what we have is a government, successive governments, not this government or the last government, but successive governments that have, if you like, refused to perform one of their primary functions and justifications for existence, namely the protection of people as they go about their law-abiding business. And there's another very simple consideration that just doesn't seem to enter the popular, or at least the intellectual consciousness, namely that if it is true that most prisoners are poor and come from poor backgrounds, and that is true, that's true in almost every society, it is also true that their victims come from the same class of society. And since the class of victims is very much larger than the class of perpetrators, even now, the fact is that failing to incapacitate the perpetrators is to create more victims. Now, if it is claimed, as it is claimed, that you can rehabilitate people, then of course you should rehabilitate them and then they will stop committing crimes. But even the idea of rehabilitation rather implies that they're not making decisions. It's, you know, prison is not sort of moral physiotherapy or a way of straightening out people, though it's a good thing if they do. If you look at the statistics, actually, you find that they straighten themselves out with the passage of time, more or less. I mean, I'm not saying everyone does, but when you look at the age at which people come into prison, you will see that very few come into prison after the age of 39 for a new offence. In other words, offending stops almost spontaneously in most people. Not, of course, I'm not talking, you can't say anything universally. But when it comes to crimes like burglary and assault, for whatever reason, partly biological, no doubt, the offending just stops of itself. Now, if you put all these things together, it seems to me the penological consequences are obvious. If you want to protect society, which is, after all, one of the reasons that, possibly the main reason, that government is constituted. But if you can see a flaw in that, please let me know.
No, I don't. Another issue I wanted to talk about with you was sentimentality, which you've written
Yes.
about. And I think your identification of the death of Diana as an important indicator of a shift in the way in which the public think about big issues, I found really interesting. I wonder if you could just explain that, please.
Well, there was an outpouring of emotion, or in my view, I can't say, of course I can't speak for what people actually felt, but it seemed to me a pseudo-emotion and also a degree of emotional bullying after her death. The terrible scenes of grief for a woman who, after all, in my opinion anyway, did not have any particular virtues other than God-given beauty at one time, seemed to me extraordinary. The piles of teddy bears, the teddy bearization of our emotional life, which incidentally you can see in cemeteries. I've written about that too, how sentimental, but at the same time shallow, it seems to me, people's emotions have become. And Diana was that revealed it in public to an astonishing degree. If you compare that with, for example, the death of Winston Churchill in 1965, I think and after all, Winston Churchill's achievements were rather greater than Diana's, then I think you'll see the point.
So in the 30 years between Churchill's death and Diana's death, what do you think it was which caused this enormous change?
Yeah, well, that's a very difficult question. I always have great difficulty with causative explanations of this kind of change, because people want to say, like Virginia Woolf did, you know, human nature changed on the 10th of November 1910, or whenever it was she said that it changed. So, of course, things are a gradation, or in Britain's case, a slippery slope. And so I can't quite put my finger on it. But certainly there's been a loss of any sense of genuine authority. So everyone has become an authority to himself, and children are authorities almost to their parents now in many cases. And so I think this leads to a sentimentalisation. But what actually caused it, I think in Britain's case, and I can't prove this, I mean, this is all speculative, I think it's the decline of the country as an important country, a decline in power, that meant for people they were no longer part of any project or any collectivity that was greater than themselves. And they lost belief in religion, of course. Religion is dead in this country, I would say. Strong belief is dead. It's been a long time dying, but it's now pretty near dead. They didn't have any belief. They don't have any belief in any political ideology, which is possibly a good thing. I don't want people to be ideologically inspired, but nevertheless, ideologies do give a meaning, a transcendent meaning to life. They have been deculturated. I used to ask my patients to name a British Prime Minister other than the present Prime Minister or Mrs. Thatcher. They'd all heard of Mrs. Thatcher. But any other, and they would say, I don't know, I wasn't born then, as if they couldn't be expected to know anything about their country other than by their personal experience of it. So they had no sense of being part of anything. And so there is only the ups and downs then of your emotional life. There weren't even families, of course. So I think that, I don't know whether that answers the question.
Yeah, and I think probably one of places where this stems from is in the schools and what's being taught to children and how it's being taught. Do you see a big problem in education?
I think there's a very big problem in education. I mean, I find it absolutely astonishing that people can have 80, what is it, it's about £80,000 spent on them per head and come out knowing so little, probably in some cases knowing less than when they went in. And certainly, for example, I used to see the children of Muslim parents who had withdrawn their daughters at the age of 12 from school, illegally, of course. But nevertheless, those children were actually knew no less than children who had continued their education until the age of 16. So actually, schools had become, if you like, not exactly a babysitting service, but certainly one that imparted no knowledge whatsoever, except that they did actually impart a kind of attitude to life, so that all the children knew about slave trade and one or two other things, but they didn't, they knew they'd probably been told that there were such things as the Romans. But whether the slave trade came before the Romans or the Romans came after the slave trade, they wouldn't know. They had no concept of historical time. In 15 years, I had many patients between the ages of 16 and 25. I met 3. I used to ask them questions, and I think I had 3 who knew when the Second World War was. And were able to give the years. And the acme was the one who I thought I was very impressed by was the one who concluded from the fact that there'd been a Second World War that there'd been a First World War. So that is the level of education of a large number of people. I haven't done a proper scientific survey, but it was absolutely astonishing to me that people didn't know that Berlin was the capital of Germany. They didn't know that France was the capital of Paris was the capital of France. It was almost impossible to find out anything that they had actually been taught. And their arithmetical knowledge was no better. So I found this very alarming, and their educational level was actually lower than that in a Tanzanian village.
Seems extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. It's a miracle. It's a miracle wrought by our educational system. And nobody seems outraged by this. When I used to give little tests of reading, I'm not a pedagogue, and I'm not I'm not an expert in any way on this kind of question, but I would give them something to read, and they would read it as if it were written in hieroglyphs or ideographs, because when they came to a word, they would say, "I don't know that one." So if they didn't recognize it, they couldn't read it. And if I said to them after they'd gone through a passage, a sentence or two, what did it mean? They would say, "I don't know, I was only reading it." Now, how is it possible? And they weren't not of deficient intelligence, incidentally. It's not that they were what used to be called mentally subnormal. They were of perfectly adequate intelligence. So I thought that this was, as I said, it was a miracle, but unfortunately a very bad miracle. And I think this is is rather alarming for the future of the country. Not that I'm going to see it, I'm too old to see it, but I think it is alarming. And the only hope is that things are deteriorating at an equal rate in other countries. And people are complaining in France of the deterioration of the educational system and the educational level. I think they're probably 20 years behind us. But I was walking past the school the other day, and everywhere there was a stamp, climate crisis, on the steps. These were for very young children. But surveys show that French children are not learning to read properly, as British children have not been taught to read properly. And it's not as if it's impossible to teach children to read properly. It's been shown that you can teach almost any child to read properly. So the question is, why has this happened?
Yeah. And do you know?
Do I know the answer? Well, I think it's the schools of education that have done it. I have no other explanation for it. Also, of course, the fact is that there are many parents now who don't seem to understand the value or the necessity of education for their children. And there was, you're too young to remember it, but there was a pop song, if you remember, you don't remember, so, which was titled, "We Don't Want No Education." We don't want no education. We don't want no thought control. As if you can think without education. What's very the thing that I've been interested in is reading some Welsh writers who grew up in the early part of the 20th century and who left school pretty early, either 14 or at 16. And they wrote far better English than the average PhD student now.
Yeah,
now, of course, they were exceptionally good people because they wrote, but nevertheless, they had received a basic education which was clearly very sound, and they were not rich.
That's certainly a point that lots of people raise. How with the destruction of the grammar schools, people from low-income backgrounds are no longer rising as they did in the 50s and 60s, going to Oxford and Cambridge, because we didn't have grammar schools anymore.
Yes, I mean, I suppose what you can say is that an egalitarian, a supposedly egalitarian system has actually made things less egalitarian than it was, than the system was before. And that's also true, incidentally, of the National Health Service, which is held up. I mean, thank God I haven't been in England with all this ridiculous thanks to the NHS and all that kind of thing, which I find sickening, actually. It's perfectly true, of course, that doctors and nurses and others have done their very best and have been devoted and all that, but they don't need the NHS to be devoted, and it's nothing to do with the NHS. That devotion is to be seen everywhere. It's not just in Britain. But the NHS has not been egalitarian in its effects, rather the reverse, which not many people seem to know.
Just as we're almost running out of time, as an end note, do you see any hope or any way in which things could be changed, and what people listening might or should do to try and reverse some of the trends that we see today?
Well, I don't have the answer. Again, like to most of your questions, I don't have definitive answers. I can only suggest that people who, of goodwill, try to change the intellectual and moral atmosphere, because you can't. I don't believe that you can just change everything from top down. You can't impose things very easily unless people themselves realize that there's something wrong. They're not going to be prepared to change, even if the government badgers them to change. So I think certainly the first task is the recognition of the phenomena. And if you don't recognize the phenomena, or if you don't think it matters, I mean, there are some people who don't think it matters, then you won't be able to do anything. But that is a long-term process, and I hope that the other way that things might change, which is a catastrophe, doesn't happen. But this present climate, the present epidemic, which threatens our economy and I think shines a light on our imprudence in the past, can lead either to an improvement, or of course can lead to something very nasty indeed. But I don't have any messianic message to give.
Well, on that note, Theodore, thank you so much for speaking to CUCA today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.